Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Today's video is going to be about the Daredevil. The Daredevil is one of the two new playtest classes that Paizo released a few weeks ago. I already made a video talking about the Slayer, two videos in fact. Part 1 is linked above, and today I'm going to talk about the Daredevil. The Daredevil is odd. Overall, it actually has a much simpler chassis than the Slayer, but I think that chassis and all the combinations that come out of it and just the complexities that go into its action economy, its gameplay style, its role in the party, they're a lot deeper than people are giving them credit for. And that's why it took a while to think about this video, to script out this video and just make sure I'm understanding what the intent of the class is, what it's trying to do in a party, and how well it succeeds at both filling out its character fantasy as well as filling out its role within a party. So let's get into it. Now, before we get into the Daredevil's details, I wanted to make a little bit of a PSA about the negativity surrounding the Daredevil that I have seen online. There is a lot of negative reactions to the Daredevil, much more so than I saw for the Slayer. Both of the classes have got a little bit of negativity in terms of having thematic overlap with existing options. With the Slayer, a lot of the negativity was really directed at the Ranger, not at the Slayer itself, and I do cover that in the end of my second part of the Slayer video. But the Daredevil's negativity is mostly aimed towards the Daredevil itself. A lot of claims like, nobody asked for this, or this is just a wrestler swashbuckler class archetype, or something along those lines. And in my opinion, these are not really fair criticisms. Does the Daredevil have some thematic overlap with the swashbuckler? Absolutely, yes. I would describe the Daredevil as being halfway between a swashbuckler and a fighter with a touch of barbarian attached. But this late into the game's life, nearly any new class is going to have major overlap. A lot of the folks dismissing Daredevil as being a glorified class archetype then follow it up with one class that they really wanted to see. I'm going to use a couple of examples of that here. Shifter is one I saw a lot in one of the discords I frequent. And the Shifter has a lot of thematic overlap with the Animal Instinct Barbarian and the Untamed Order Druid. Yes, it'll be mechanically distinct, but with the Daredevil, that wasn't enough for you. It is mechanically distinct than the Swashbuckler, but if the thematic overlap for the Daredevil is enough for you to call it a useless addition to the game, the same is true for the Shifter. Likewise, the Skald. I've seen a lot of people ask for a Skald in 2nd edition because it was a popular class in 1st edition. And it has a lot of thematic overlap with the Warrior Bard and the Barbarian. Classes like the Necromancer are largely an exception. Necromancer is pretty unique in that it managed to fill out a design space that many consider poorly filled out. And even then, it has so much thematic overlap with existing options. It has overlap with Boundary Wizard, Gluttony Wizard, Undead Master Archetype, and that one archetype from Battlecry that lets you summon like a troop of undead. It has thematic overlap with all these options, doesn't it? We're really late into the game's life. There are 27 classes in the game, soon to be 29. There are many, many, many more archetypes beyond that, and that's not even counting multi-class combinations of archetypes. Everything they can come up with is going to have thematic overlap with other existing options. That is not a bad thing. That means we're playing a 7-year-old game that is so full of options that the majority of character concepts can be at least decently represented. And it's fair if decent isn't enough for you. It's fair if you don't want to play an Animal Instinct Barbarian or Untamed Druid and that you want a Shifter, but it's also fair to want the Daredevil for its distinctness from the Swashbuckler, even if that doesn't appeal to you specifically. And that is where I get to my second point. The nobody asked for this argument is pretty damn tone deaf, in my opinion. None of us, not you, not me, not that person on Reddit who's mad about the Swashbuckler, nobody has a perfect grasp of what people are asking for. Hell, even Paizo probably does not have perfect data. It just makes its best educated guesses based on as much data as it can gather. I don't think anyone gets to confidently say what nobody has asked for. And again, just like with the Shifter and Scald earlier, I have seen a lot of people use arguments that go, nobody asked for this. Clearly, Paizo should have released this one class that I wanted to see. Just because within your bubble, people have asked for that class doesn't mean everybody wants it. And just because in your bubble, nobody asked for their Daredevil, doesn't mean that nobody else asked for it. I know in my play groups, the Daredevil is way more exciting of an option than a Shifter ever would have been. And I personally am way more excited for a Slayer than I would ever have been for a Scald. So we do need to cool it on this argument that nobody asked for this. In fact, I find it really hard to believe that nobody wants the Daredevil, because there's an entire other tactical game competing in the same space as Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where every martial plays a little bit like the Daredevil. Draw steal. So maybe Paizo is just appealing to the players who enjoy that aspect of draw steal but miss it when they're playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Or maybe it's not even that. Maybe people have specifically asked for this character concept in Paizo's surveys and we just haven't been privy to that data. And a lot of the online spaces we look at are kind of echo chambery and drowning out that data. So I don't think it's fair to use either of those above two arguments, that nobody asked for this or that it has thematic overlap with the Swashbuckler. And finally, one can maybe make the argument that we don't need new classes at all, that we should be getting subclasses and class archetypes and archetypes and revamps to classes that are considered perhaps a little under budget, like say Ranger or Psychic. That is a fair argument, but it's still a little flimsy, because a lot of us have a pet class we would like to see. All the people who are upset about the Daredevil and wanted to see the Shifter don't want to see no new classes, they want to see one new class. Likewise for the people who want to see the Scald. A couple years ago, anyone who wanted to see a Necromancer would have said this. A couple years before that, anyone who wanted to see a Guardian or Commander would have said this. It wouldn't have been fair to just dismiss all of them and saying, nope, we're done getting all the classes we need, and I don't think it's fair now. For my part, I would like to see a Shepherd class, a class that's mechanically similar to the Necromancer, but thematically all about using animals and plants as your allies. And maybe there's not a lot of interest in it, but the point is we all probably have one or two concepts that are kind of our pet concepts that are not perfectly represented, and we'd like to see them. And it is completely fair that Paizo is releasing 2 new classes to try and fill out some people's pet character fantasies. In this case, the Daredevil and the Slayer. Sorry for the overly long preamble, let's talk about the actual Daredevil now. First, let's talk about the general stuff, the flavor and the class chassis. The flavor of the Daredevil is that you are a character who rushes into danger, rushes into combat, and kind of enjoy being cornered. And already I feel like this is not identical to the Swashbuckler. The Swashbuckler is all about finesse and flair. Even the wrestler Swashbuckler, despite being strength-focused, is still a very dexterous and flamboyant character. For the Daredevil, I picture more like a Jackie Chan character, one who kind of uses anything and everything at their disposal, mixing in the environment and rushing into danger and surprising enemies with their athleticism. And yeah, there is definitely thematic overlap with the Swashbuckler here. I just don't think it's as identical as people are saying it is. Now for the chassis. For starters, they can take either Strength or Dex as their key attribute, and they're an 8 HP class. Beyond this, they have mostly standard martial progression. I'm gonna put it all up on the screen, but it's pretty much what you expect. Weapon proficiency, armor proficiency, perception, etc. at all the same levels, and your saves go Master, Master, Expert in Fort, Reflex, Will. Fairly standard martial stuff. Now right off the bat, a lot of people see the chassis and criticize the Daredevil's defenses, and I am inclined to agree. They're an 8 HP class that only gets light armor. So actually in that regard, their armor progression, they're a little behind a typical martial. By default, being locked into light armor, you're going to need a pretty high dex score. But as you'll see, strength is a pretty important part of the Daredevil's toolkit. Every Daredevil is going to need at least a little bit of strength. So it feels like you're a little too multiple attribute dependent, where you both need strength and dex to be scaling quite a bit. And that's not a death sentence. Plenty of martials do well with strength and dex scaling at the same time, but it's still a little annoying when you're also an 8 HP class that also doesn't have any particularly good saves. For example, why doesn't the Daredevil get Legendary in Reflex? And you also don't have an excellent perception, so it's not like you're going early in the combat and thus setting up for more active and proactive defenses, right? I do think the Daredevil needs defensive boosts. Some would argue that it would be a bit of a flavor fail to give the Daredevil defensive boosts. For example, I've seen a lot of people say it should be a 10 HP class, not 8 HP, and I do agree, it would be a flavor fail, because if you're a 10 HP class, you're not really being daring, you're just among the most resilient warriors in the world, right? That being said, I don't think giving the Daredevil functionally good defenses and still matching their flavor needs to be mutually exclusive. Just give them active defenses. That's how spellcasters get their defense, right? Arcane and Primal spellcasters with low defenses, like say wizards and witches, they still feel like they have better defenses than their class chassis due to spells like Interposing Earth, Hidebound, False Vitality, Endure, Wooden Double, Zephyr Slip, Drop Dead, Unexpected Transposition. The list is endless. You have a lot of active ways of defending yourself, and thus you don't feel as squishy as you would look on paper. And you can kind of do the same with the Daredevil. Just give them a lot of active defensive boosts. For instance, give them a permanent circumstance bonus to reflex saves based on certain environmental factors. Maybe give them 8 HP per level, but give them easy ways to get temp HP. And the class does have some of it, it just needs more of this, and it needs this to come not from feats. This needs to be built into the class chassis, in my opinion. Next up, besides the standard numerical stuff, there are a few passives that the Daredevil gets throughout the levels. First, you get a plus 10-foot circumstance bonus to your speed. You also get the Die Hard feat, and you heal extra from medicine checks, both battle medicine and treat wounds. This is all pretty nice. The battle medicine one is a little conditional because not all parties rely on medicine checks for in-combat healing and or out-of-combat healing. And it's a little hard for you to be the one spec'd into it because, one, you're pretty multi-attribute dependent to begin with, and two, you're also multi-skill dependent. So it's gonna be pretty hard for you to have scaling medicine alongside the scaling athletics and acrobatics that you need. But these are all still nice boosts. I will note in particular that the speed boost is unique. It is a circumstance bonus. Most class-based speed boosts are status bonuses. This means it stacks with Tailwind. And yeah, it sucks that it's always meta to have a wand of Tailwind on you at all times, but that is how it is. And with Tailwind up, you will be the second fastest character in the game. The fastest, of course, being the monk. But your speed boost is conditional on a thing that I will be talking about later called props. Next up at level 3, you get the Deny Advantage feature, where lower level enemies than you cannot flank you, and you have a +1 or 2 circumstance bonus to AC against reaction attacks. The number changes depending on whether you have adrenaline or not. The boost to AC against reaction attacks is pretty nice because you might be taking a lot of those just by virtue of how much mobility you want to use. I don't think it's enough for the situations where reactive strike is a problem. I think you need a little bit something else. Maybe resistance to reaction attacks would be really nice. And finally, at level 19, when you activate your class feature called Adrenaline, you gain half your level in temp HP. This is a very good feature. This is also a feature that should not be at level 19. It needs to be way earlier, like level 7, maybe even as low as level 3. Give them a different level 19 capstone ability, but they definitely need something going for them at lower levels for survivability. The temp HP would be a great way to make them feel like survivable enough without just making them a 10 HP marshal. So to keep the flavor intact. So overall, the chassis fits the flavor it's going for, that's for sure. I just think it needs some tweaks to make the Daredevil a fundamentally better class before we move on to all of the rest of these things and see how they fit together. Because I really don't think the Daredevil's far from being good. It's just several small tweaks away from being good. Now, let's talk about the gameplay loop of the Daredevil. Your loop revolves around two things: adrenaline and the risky trait. Whenever you perform an action with the risky trait, you will gain adrenaline till the start of your next turn. By default, every Daredevil has one risky action: Daring Stunt. It's pretty simple. It's one action. You stride, leap, or use one of the corresponding movement types. If you move at least 10 feet and end your movement adjacent to an enemy, you can attempt to grapple, reposition, shove, or trip one of them. And then, because you did a risky action, you're going to have adrenaline. Now, the flavor of risky is that this only applies to actions that put you at some kind of risk. So many of them involve taking a gamble of some kind, putting yourself in close proximity to danger willingly, or taking a risk that you'll crit fail and have something bad happen to you. Now, beyond Daring Stunt, there are some feats you can pick up that add the risky trait to other actions. For example, there's a feat at level 1 that adds the risky trait to the Feint action. Now, Feint is a basic action which has pretty marginal value in my opinion, and I don't think it having risky will make it usable on a Daredevil because you're much better off just using an athletics option, but hey, that is an option you have. Then there are feats that give you new risky actions. These are not attached to any existing basic skill action. These are just entirely bespoke ways of gaining risky. I'll be doing a showcase of many of them later on in the video. Some of them are really cool, some of them need some work. And notably, Daredevils have fighter-like class feat progression. At level 6, and I think the second level is 14, you gain access to additional feats that you can swap on a per-day basis. At level 20, you're allowed to pick a capstone feat that adds a third feat to that line of flexible feats that you can pick. That, plus at level 1, you actually have one additional class feat that you must spend on something with the risky trait. So all in all, you're going to be flooded in feats. You're going to have no trouble picking a good selection of risky options and their payoffs. Finally, the GM is allowed to determine that an action has the risky trait in a fiction-first way. The guidelines suggest that if something deals damage to you automatically, or if it risks dealing damage to you on a failed check, it should have the risky trait. So for example, moving into hazardous terrain to get to an enemy is something almost any GM is going to award you the risky trait for. So that's the first half of their gameplay loop. But what do you do with the adrenaline that you gain by taking a risky action? Well, for starters, you have the level 3 and level 19 features I mentioned on the previous slide. You gain certain bonuses while you have adrenaline, and starting at level 19, you gain temp HP while you have adrenaline. But that's not all. You also get this level 1 feature called Audacious Combatant. What this does is it reduces the multiple attack penalty of options with the press trait by 1. So a follow-up attack, if it has the press trait, will be -4 by default, -3 if it had the agile trait as well, and -8 on the third attack, and -6 if it had the agile trait. This is a pretty nice benefit. As you'll see later on, the Daredevil has a lot of really powerful press actions it can take, and this boosting them and making them more reliable is just fantastic. I will note here though, the Daredevil gets no press actions by default. You must pick them up via feats, and I think that is a bit of a signposting issue, and honestly, the Daredevil has many signposting issues overall, which we'll get into at the end of this video. But again, because you have so many feats, you're not really going to have trouble picking out the right options. You just have to see that you need to do so, and this might trip up newbie players. So this isn't a class I would recommend to inexperienced players. Then there are quite a few feats that directly require adrenaline to give you a powerful effect, even if they don't have the press trait attached. And finally, adrenaline enables something called stunt damage, which we're going to get into next. Props and stunt damage. What is a prop? Props are something defined by the Daredevil class as anything large and sturdy enough to push yourself off of. Thankfully, the class goes into a bit more detail, so it's not all GM fiat. For one, it explicitly says that a creature that is larger than you is a prop. And I know a lot of people saw this and immediately leaped to the assumption that tiny Daredevils will now be meta, because that means your allies are always going to serve as props for you. Tiny Daredevils are not at all meta. Daredevils have a big reliance on athletics maneuvers, which are size dependent, and many of their feats are also size dependent, and you can't even overrule their requirements with Titan Wrestler, which, regardless of whether you consider that a flaw or not, Tiny Daredevils are not anywhere close to being meta. The benefits you get from your allies always counting as props are mostly outweighed by the fact that the majority of your toolkit won't work on large creatures or creatures bigger than that. Then they specify that a wall, column, or really any durable terrain feature like a large rock can serve as a prop. This is vague, but really, I would say anything that's a medium-sized object or larger and just, in a fiction first sense, has any durability to it is a prop. It also specifies that the GM is allowed to overrule some things not being a prop. For example, a huge ooze might not be sturdy enough to serve as a prop, so you can't just say push someone into that ooze to deal damage. I'm not sure that this is necessary, and it might invite some adversarial GMing / players asking for a lot more props than they want, and I don't know if that dynamic needs to be there. Maybe this sentence does not need to exist, but I understand what they're doing from a simulationist approach. And finally, there are rules that imply that the ground cannot be a prop. But as written, the ground is a durable feature, so you should be able to use it as a prop for some things, but clearly not for others. For example, I mentioned earlier that your speed is conditional on starting your turn next to a prop. If the ground is a prop, nearly every turn you're in will start next to a prop, which feels unintended. And then there are other feats where they specify that you're using the ground as a prop in terms of stunt damage, which we'll get to. But if they feel the need to specify that, that means the ground must not be a prop by default. So maybe this needs clarification in the final rules just to make it abundantly clear that the ground is not a prop. So what do you do with props? Well, aside from getting speed boosts off of them, they can be used to deal stunt damage. When you have adrenaline and you forcibly move a target and its movement is then interrupted by a prop, so you shove someone 10 feet and they move 5 feet and they hit a prop. When that happens, that target will take 1d6 plus strength bludgeoning damage. And then this scales up at levels 5, 9, 13, and 17. In my opinion, this is a pretty damn good feature. I have seen some folks underrating it because it can be a little circumstantial to turn on. You cannot guarantee that you're always getting this, but I think that is a short-sighted approach. The criticism of stunt damage not being always on inherently comes from this assumption that every single marshal needs a damage booster that then helps them be a dedicated damage dealer. But we're well past the point of all marshals being dedicated damage dealers. It's just not true anymore. Commanders don't have a damage booster. Guardians don't have a damage booster. Exemplars can either entirely opt out of having a damage booster or end up not having it for, say, half their turns, depending on how they cycle their spark. Selfless champions don't have a damage booster. A bunch of classes like the Ranger and the Slayer have subclasses that don't get damage boosters. This is normal for marshals, and people always react to it negatively, but I think that's just a short-sighted reaction. Not every marshal is a dedicated damage dealer. Once you get through the Daredevil's full list of feats, class features, etc., it's very clear that the Daredevil is meant to be a debuffing and controlling marshal, with any damage they deal being incidental. And stunt damage is great as incidental damage. It does have a few issues, and I will get into a few of those issues at the end of this video. But dismissing it out of hand simply because it's not always on like a few other damage boosters like Rage or Sneak Attack, which is basically always on because of how easy off guard is to get, I think that is a little short-sighted. The Daredevil's not trying to be a dedicated damage dealer, and I'd really like it if we didn't try to shoehorn every marshal into being a dedicated damage dealer. We're seeing the same criticism for the Slayer, where people say the Blood-Seeking Blade is the default subclass because it's the only one that has a damage booster. No, not every marshal needs a damage booster. Marshals serve a variety of roles in the party, and sometimes they serve that role without needing an always-on damage booster. The Daredevil is exactly like that. It's a controller and debuffer that has an incidental damage boost whenever that matters. Now we'll talk about the Daredevil and its press feats. And this is where all the overlap with the fighter comes in. Superficially, all the overlap thus far has been with the Swashbuckler. You use bravado / risky, you set up for a finisher / a press action. But that is a superficial similarity. Press actions and finishers have a pretty significant difference. Finishers are very all in. You cannot take attack actions after your finisher, and while there are finishers that are pretty reliable to use as a second strike, for example, Confident Finisher, which deals half damage on a miss, using them on a first strike maximizes your chances of critting and thus generating big spikes of value. So the Swashbuckler's action economy is very much set up bravado, do something auxiliary, and then use a finisher. The Daredevil does not have that action economy. Press trait actions tend to be highly efficient and very incremental compared to finishers. So you're going to have sequencing that's much more about gaining multiple attack penalty with something you do at the start of your turn, like say trip, or just a plain old strike, or a flourish action that gets you to the right position. And then you use a press action. And you'll start to see how the sequencing works as we go through these feats. So first up, Forceful Kickoff Stunt. One action with both the press and risky traits. Now, this might seem confusing to you. Risky is meant to set up your press actions, correct? So why would you ever use something that's both press and risky? Well, risky specifies that when you take this action, you gain adrenaline before you make any checks that were part of this action. This means that as soon as you use Forceful Kickoff Stunt, you immediately have adrenaline, and therefore you benefit from Audacious Combatant for your press trait. This means it's actually impossible to use this action without having adrenaline on. So how does it work? You try an acrobatics check against their fortitude DC. On a critical success, they're pushed 15 feet, you leap, and you don't trigger reactions. On a success, same thing, but they're only pushed 5 feet. On a failure, you just leap, and there's no exclusion of reactions here, and on a critical failure, you just become off guard and do nothing else. This is pretty good for skirmishers. You run in, you trip an enemy, you use Forceful Kickoff Stunt, you push them a bunch, you get out of their melee range, and if your party's coordinating with you, they can now focus on other targets while this one is prone and has been moved away from the front line. This is a pretty excellent feat, and if the enemy happens to have a prop behind them, it's also going to do some damage. This is kind of what I meant when I called the damage the Daredevil does more incidental. The Daredevil's not really trying to be a high-key damage dealer. It's trying to be a controller who also deals damage on the side, like say a wizard would, where you would set up your control spells on turns 1 to 2, and then taper off with focus spells or cantrips that deal damage. I will note one thing I really don't like about this feat though. Remember at the beginning when I said the Daredevil's gonna feel starved for skills? This is why. This uses an acrobatics check. So you're already pretty incentivized to have strength and dexterity because you're using athletics checks and you have light armor, and now you need to be maxing out both your acrobatics and athletics. And yes, you do need to be maxing out on them because you can't afford to critically fail if you're just up against something that has a high fortitude, right? I talked about this in my skills video where, yes, you don't have to max everything out to legendary all the time, but if something is going to be your combat staple, you really should be maxing it, especially if it has a crit failure risk, and this one does, which means a lot of Daredevils are going to find themselves locked into scaling both acrobatics and athletics every opportunity they get, and that massively reduces the amount of variety you can get out of a Daredevil. I think Paizo should give us auto-scaling acrobatics and or athletics. Maybe one, ideally both. Like, I feel like the Daredevil's chassis right now is thin enough that it can afford 2 auto-scaling skills, and it's not an issue. Next up, Wheeling Pull Stunt. Same idea as Forceful Kickoff Stunt, but rather than push, you are pulling. Note here that this is an athletics check versus reflex. That problem will keep coming up of athletics and acrobatics both being needed. On a critical success, you grab the enemy, you step, and you can drag them with you up to 10 feet, as long as they remain adjacent to you, and this movement doesn't break your grab. Success, same thing, but the enemy can only be moved 5 feet. On a failure, you still get to step, which is actually nice. You won't trigger reactions, but you don't grab the enemy, and if you already had them grab, this actually ends your grab. And on a critical failure, you trigger reactions and don't get to do anything else, as if you had moved. This does feel like a pretty fantastic feat. I feel like pulling enemies is kind of a gap in the game. It's pretty hard to do. You end up having to take these really awkward motions of repositioning enemies, and sure, with GM Fiat, you might be able to do like a shove, but pulling, but it's pretty limited in value. This is a good feat to have, in my opinion. This could be a table variance thing, but I often find myself in situations where I wish I could pull enemies around. Next up, rebounding fall stunt. You must fall prone, attempt an acrobatics check against the enemy's fortitude. On a critical success, the target falls prone, you get to stand up without triggering reactions, and you deal stunt damage to them. This is what I was talking about when I said that the ground can sometimes be used as a prop. On a success, same thing as critical success, but the target does not take stunt damage. On a failure, you don't get to bring the target down, but you do get to crawl away from them. Not a fan of that one. I have never, ever in my life been in a circumstance where I'm like, I would love to crawl from this enemy. But this is a risky press trait option, right? And on a critical failure, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage as you fall, and you can't stand until your next turn, which is crazy. Now, this is an okay feat. It does have the press and risky traits, which means it can set itself up, but really, I don't see much value to it. All this seems like a way of doing is letting a Dex user trip enemies with Dex, but there's no value to it since it has the press trait, because even if your strength is lower than your Dex, your first athletics check made with strength is going to be higher than your second acrobatics check made with dex, even though you have Audacious Combatant on. So this feat needs a little bit of a tune-up. You will notice that the other two feats I mentioned are uniquely good at doing things that Rebounding Fall Stunt isn't. Forceful Kickoff on a crit gets a big chunk of force movement, and you get to move on any degree other than critical failure. Wheeling Pull Stunt does an entirely unique interaction that isn't possible with basic actions without GM Fiat, and the GM Fiat is not going to let you get this much value out of them. Rebounding Fall Stunt is really just trip with the dex, and on a crit success, instead of 1d6, you deal stunt damage, and I don't think it's that good. In particular, the fact that you fall prone and then stand up without reactions seems cool visually, but you're just reflavoring what happens on a trip anyways. And note, on all 3 of these feats, there is a size restriction that says the target cannot be more than 1 size larger than you. This means, in my opinion, that large daredevils are the meta play, not tiny ones, because it's okay if gargantuan creatures are out of your size reach, but you really don't want huge creatures to be out of it too. So I have a feeling that if this goes through to release without changing it, I will end up playing large daredevils more often than medium ones. Next up, Pressing Pummel. This is a press 2-action ability that basically just does vicious swing stuff. It adds a d10 of damage, and it scales up to 2d10 and 3d10 at various levels. I think this feat is a tad bit undertuned. Let's go with Vicious Swing as our comparison. First off, Vicious Swing has the option, at least, to add d12s. Now, this is better in that a Daredevil is pretty heavily incentivized to have one hand free, so they're probably not using a d12 weapon, but the Bastard Sword exists. You could have used a d12 weapon at some point in your rotation, and the Daredevil will pretty much never have the option to do that. That being said, d10 versus adding a weapon damage die is basically the same. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. The real problem with this in comparison to Vicious Swing is that when the fighter has Vicious Swing and Furious Focus, they're getting to use 2-action Vicious Swing into 1-action anything, including some of their fantastic press trait options. A Bastard Sword fighter, for example, can go Vicious Swing, let go of her sword, combat grab, and that's an excellent 3-action sequence if you were already in melee. This, on the other hand, needs you to open with something with the attack trait and then use this as a 2-action follow-up, which is likelier to miss. It does have Audacious Combatant, but it's still likelier to miss. In fact, with that fighter comparison above, the Vicious Swing, which you make, will be at a +2 relative to the Daredevil's accuracy, and then the second follow-up attack, the Combat Grab in that example, is actually still going to be +1 ahead of the Daredevil's Audacious Combatant accuracy. So I don't think Pressing Pummel is good enough. I think it needs to actually start at 2d10 and scale up to 4d10, maybe even 5d10 by level 18, so it is a little undertuned. Next up, Trip Up. And again, this is very reminiscent of a fighter feat. It feels like Intimidating Strike. Intimidating Strike does Frightened, this does Clumsy. And again, you can see that this having the press trait makes it more awkward. You don't want to put 2 actions into something that has the press trait. I think the Daredevil needs both of these 2-action press trait feats to be made a lot better, or to be made 1-action. I think these would be completely fine as 1-action feats. Maybe the D10s in the previous one become D6s. I don't know. I think it'd be completely fine. Either really up the reward for the 2 actions, or reduce it down to 1 action. Next up, Hit or Miss. This is both a flourish and press feat, and it has the risky trait. So again, it enables itself for press. You make a melee strike. On a hit, you do the same thing as strikes always would. On a critical success, you triple your damage rather than doubling it. On a failure, you get to deal half of all the non-dice damage that you would have dealt, and on a critical failure, you provoke a reaction from your opponent. And note here that this doesn't say it's just a manipulate action or that you're provoking as if you had moved out of the square the way Wheeling Pull Stunt does. This one just says the enemy gets to make a strike, which means every enemy will get to make a strike even if they don't have a reactive strike or an equivalent. So this is a very high risk option, especially because it has the press trait. But I think tripling damage is fantastic. This is the sort of thing that I think you need to use with setup. Ask an ally for aid. Make sure you have a hero point handy. And with those sorts of setup, this can be a really good and powerful option for you. The next feat I want to talk about is Knee to the Nethers. This feat does exactly what it says in the name. You grapple an opponent, you attempt an unarmed strike against a particularly sensitive region, and then if you hit and get to deal damage, the target automatically becomes Sickened 1. What's even nicer is that the multiple attack penalty doesn't increase until after both your grapple and strike are done. So the strike will most likely be made at your second multiple attack penalty. This is a fantastic feat. Sickened is a debuff that does not wear off unless they spend an action coughing and retching to try to get rid of it with a fortitude save. Grappling means they cannot escape you without spending an action. And since this has press, you will probably have comboed into it with something. For example, something like Daring Stunt to run in, trip them, then grapple them, and inflict Sickened 1 with this, and deal some damage. This is effectively this class's version of Combat Grab, except on steroids, because this is quite a bit more powerful than Combat Grab can be. It is a great and powerful way to lock down single targets in a very devastating way. And finally, let's talk about risky overextension. And this, in my opinion, is how you do 2 action press options on the Daredevil. First up, it has risky itself, which means you don't need another risky action to set it up like you do for Pressing Pummel and Trip Up. And then what's its effect? You make a melee strike. Hits are upgraded into critical hits. Critical hits add the deadly D10 trait to your weapon, replacing any trait it already has. I wish they would change this to upping the die of any deadly trait you had, but regardless, that's fine. If you critically miss, you become stunned 1, and you're off guard regardless of the outcome. But damn, this is a good feat. Like, this is the sort of thing I would want out of 2 action press options. So I really hope Pressing Pummel and Trip Up are brought up to par. So I hope this sort of gave you a picture of what the sequencing for the Daredevil looks like. It is quite different from the Swashbuckler. It's feeling much more like the Fighter, where you're using an opening attack of some kind to then set up really efficient press options. And obviously, there are some bad picks among these press options that really do need to be ironed out before release. But there are good picks as well, and I think the good ones are pretty damn good. Next up, let's talk about some more adrenaline payoffs. First up, Don't Mess With Me. This is a level 1 reaction, requires you to be trained in intimidation, and when you critically hit an enemy while you have adrenaline already, you get to make a demoralized attempt at an enemy within 60 feet of you that's different than the one you just crit. If you're legendary intimidation, this is a free action rather than a reaction. Pretty nice feat, pretty reminiscent of the rogue's You're Next with a different trigger, and notably it scales really well into that high level feat which you saw in the previous slide that upgrades your hit into a crit. So keep that in mind, you'll have really accurate follow-up attacks that can also be upgraded into crits, and you have your first attack which might just crit if you already have adrenaline. Then we have Scrambling Retreat, also a reaction, exactly the opposite flavor as Don't Mess With Me. If you're targeted by a melee attack while you have adrenaline, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to your AC against that attack. Then, regardless of whether the attack hit or missed, you can stride up to half your speed. And then there's the bad part. The attacker can choose to follow you as a free action. I don't like that at all. This feels bad. The only circumstance in which this is good is if you're using it to drag the attacker away from a more fragile enemy, but in that case, the attacker just won't follow you. The very, very narrow circumstance where I can see this being pretty good is if the enemy used one of those multi-attack things where they hit a whole bunch of foes, you were one of the first targets, you use the retreat, and now following you means ignoring your allies who were previously within that enemy's reach. That's a very marginal upside, and most of the time, this is just going to be the attacker chooses to follow you if it benefits them, in which case this effectively just gave you a +2 to AC with no other benefit, or they will just not follow you because they had a juicier target nearby and you just made your own life harder and your friends' lives harder. And this triggers reactions. So overall, this is not a great feat. It does get some upgrades later on, like it can be used against reflex saves, for example, and that does make it better. I don't think this baseline feat is good enough to justify being a feat at all, though. If this was a default class feature, I would get it, but as a feat, this is not a good option. But as a feat, it definitely needs some upgrades. Next up, we have Caroming Charge, and this is broken. It's a 2-action ability, no press trait, but it does require you to have adrenaline. You stride twice. You're allowed to move through enemies as part of this movement, and you deal stunt damage to each enemy you move through. This does trigger reactions, and you cannot end your movement in any enemy's space, but this doesn't have a limitation of once per enemy, which means if you have the speed for it, and if the map is small enough compared to your speed, you can just ping pong between 2 or 3 enemies and deal each of them several instances of your stunt damage. At level 1, this is 1d6 plus strength. It goes up by another d6 every 4 levels, and there's no save. No basic reflex save, no attack roll, no multiple attack penalty, nothing. This feat very obviously needs a once per enemy limitation, and make sure to note that in your feedback to Paizo. Then we have Wall Sweep. If you would be moved by a forced movement effect, while you have adrenaline and you're adjacent to a prop, you can use a reaction to increase the amount of forced movement by 10 feet. If you do, you decide where the forced movement takes you. Not just the extra 10 feet, the entirety. So even if you choose not to increase the amount of forced movement, you still get to choose where you're moving as part of it, with the only problem being you can't end in your original space. This is pretty nice. Force movement on enemies is not the most common thing, but it might end up mattering, especially because you as a Daredevil might be putting enemies up against the wall a lot and they might want to get out of there. So this is nice. Also notably, it remains force movement even after you're moving yourself with it, which means you don't provoke reactions no matter where you move with it. Then we have the Vigorous Adrenaline feat. This is a level 10 feat, takes an action, and you gain temp HP equal to your level plus your constitution modifier. Additionally, you reduce the value of one of those conditions, clumsy, enfeebled, sickened, by 1, and then you immediately lose adrenaline. This doesn't feel very good. I don't think you should lose adrenaline for sure at this. I think the temp HP should be a baseline class feature, and this should give something else. Something else like Fortify Self. This is a once per hour ability. It requires you to have adrenaline, and you gain resistance to all physical damage equal to half your level until the beginning of your next turn. This feels like a good feat in my opinion, unlike Vigorous Adrenaline, which kind of templated the same but is much worse. I would like temp HP to be made part of the baseline features of the Daredevil, and then this can be one of those active defenses I talked about, and then scatter a few more active defenses throughout the levels, and ideally better active defenses than Scrambling Retreat and Vigorous Adrenaline. Next up, we have Lucky Spark, yet another active defense. It's a reaction you use in response to trying to attempt a saving throw. You gain Fortune on that saving throw, and you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to that save, and then you just lose adrenaline. This is fantastic. This is what it should feel like when you're losing adrenaline to use a feature. It's also a reaction, so because you lose adrenaline at the start of your next turn anyways, there's a very low cost to having lost it here. If this feat came online a little earlier, then the Daredevil's problem with having pretty baseline saving throw scaling wouldn't be that much of a problem. That being said, this is still a very good feat. And finally, Reckless Abandon. The first time you gain adrenaline in an encounter, you become quickened for 1 minute. And this is unconditional quickened. In nearly every other circumstance in the game, quickened comes with an action restriction. Haste says you can stride, step, or strike. Lose Times Arrow says stride or step. Even the really good Slayer version of quickened, which I talked about in my Slayer reviews, still has the condition of only being usable on relentless trait actions, which notably means no spell casting. This is unconditional quicken, which is really damn nice. It'll make your action economy so much easier because now you can sequence those 2-action press actions and your various risky options much more easily than before. Now, the list of press, feats, and adrenaline payoffs is not exhaustive. I've probably missed a couple ones here or there, but I think both of these together give you a pretty good idea of what the Daredevil's gameplay loop looks like. Next up, let's talk about the risky feats. Remember, every Daredevil gets Daring Stunt as a default risky action, and it's a pretty good one. Leap plus an Athletics Maneuver. And then some of the press actions we talked about 2 slides ago also had the risky trait, meant to enable themselves because you get adrenaline before you make any of the checks that are associated with your risky action. These are actions which don't benefit themselves with the risky trait, they benefit actions that happen after them. So let's evaluate them and see how they work in the Daredevil's gameplay loop. First up, we have Breakaway Attack. Breakaway Attack is a pretty cool feat and pretty cinematic. You describe how you're using your environment, throwing a pot, breaking a door, etc. You interact with an object, and then you make a melee or ranged strike with it. Melee strikes have a d8 damage die, bludgeoning damage, and it has the finesse and deadly d8 traits. A ranged strike has a 1d6 damage die, it has a range increment of 20 feet, and it has the deadly d10 and propulsive traits. Now, right here, I want to note that I don't think this should be propulsive. Just let it have the thrown trait. Let it add all of your strength to the damage rather than half of it. At low levels, this is just 1 point of difference, and at high levels, it's maybe 1 to 2 points. I don't think it's a big deal to just let Daredevils add their full strength to the damage for the ranged strike here. So I really do hope that gets changed, but ultimately that is a minor distinction. It just annoys me that this is propulsive rather than thrown. Also, the damage scales with your hand wraps, so you will get runes benefiting both the attack roll and the damage rolls. This is all fantastic. This is a great way to use improvised weapons. My only gripe here is, why is this a feat for one class? These are such nice rules for how improvised weapons should just work at a baseline. Hell, you could just put the flourish trait to it so you can't just keep attacking from a distance, and I'd be okay with that. Improvised weapon rules, by default, are pretty lacking in my opinion. The fact that you cannot even scale the damage you do unless you have a specific archetype going for it or something like this just makes no sense to me. I wish something similar to this, maybe a weaker version of this, was the baseline improvised weapon rules, and then feats like this existed to make you better at it, rather than feats like this making this sort of gameplay possible at all. Ultimately, not the biggest deal because improvised weapons are more of a cinematic feature. No class needs them to function unless your GM loves running jail heists, but that's all besides the point. Ultimately, this is still a good feat, even if I wish this was embedded into the base game. Then there's Opening Gambit, and God, I love this feat. It's a free action you take as you roll initiative. You attempt an acrobatics check or an athletics check against the standard DC for the highest level creature in the encounter, though there might be a different DC depending on circumstances. If you succeed, your initiative roll is 19 plus your initiative modifier. On a failure, it's 1 plus your initiative modifier. I don't know why the success says 19 rather than 20. It feels like it should just be 20. But regardless, this is a really cool feat. It feels very all or nothing. You either go very high in initiative, most likely right at the top, or you go really low in initiative, most likely the last to go. But regardless, since this has the risky trait, you'll gain the benefit of having adrenaline all throughout your first turn. You're allowed to use any actions that trigger off of adrenaline, which is fantastic. Then at level 6, you can pick up Rushing Stride. This has the requirement that you don't already have adrenaline. So note the conflict between this and Opening Gambit. You can really only use one of these on your first turn of combat. You get to stride, and at the end of this movement, you can make a strike. If you do so, you automatically become off guard to every enemy other than the one you attacked, and you gain adrenaline because this was a risky action. Note the Flourish trait here as well. You cannot Breakaway Attack and Rushing Stride. So in some part, Flourish tends to pair with risky actions as well for the Daredevil. You can only use one of these opening risky options in a lot of these cases. But this is still ultimately a good feat. You can Rushing Stride to an enemy, you can make an attack, and then you can use the Wheeling Pull stunt or the Forceful Kickoff stunt to reposition the enemy, apply some crowd control, deal some stunt damage, etc. This is a pretty good feat. And once you get to higher levels, once you have those attacks that have those crit upgrades like Hit or Miss or the level 16 feat whose name I just forgot, this becomes even better because now your opening turns can be very explosive, and this is nice. This means the Daredevil is now a controller and debuffer who is also capable of some pretty big spikes of damage. Then at level 8, there's a feat called Escape Shuffle. If you're grabbed or restrained by a creature, you can attempt to escape, and then if you succeed, you can, without any map, try to reposition your enemy, and then regardless of whether you succeeded or not, you can choose to step. This is a pretty damn good feat. Enemies with grab, and especially improved grab, are terrifying to face. And this can also work against Swallow Whole, since all you're doing is attempting an escape, and yes, you are grabbed while you're swallowed whole. The fact that this works even when you're restrained is fantastic. And the fact that it has some added bonuses on top is really nice. You can get yourself out of danger, you can move the enemy into danger, etc. Then at level 12, we have Topple the Dominoes. You stride, choose up to 3 enemies within your reach at any point in that stride, and you can try to either shove or trip each of them. You roll your athletics checks separately, and they don't count towards your multiple attack penalty until the whole action is done. Note here that because this is 3 actions, you're not going to be able to follow this up with a press option right up until level 20 when you get your unconditional quickened. So ultimately, this will not feel like a significant adrenaline enabler on your own turn, besides the fact that because risky takes effect as soon as you start the action, you're going to have various bonuses to your speed, to your AC if you take a reaction attack, etc. throughout this turn. It will benefit you with adrenaline off your turn, though. It will give you temp HP if you have the level 19 feature. It will enable the reactions that consume your adrenaline, or at least require you to have adrenaline. So this is still a pretty good feat, but ultimately somewhat situational. And finally, there's Freewheeling Strike, another 3-action risky option with all of the qualifiers I talked about of not enabling on-turn adrenaline actions. This one requires you to stride adjacent to a prop the whole time, and each enemy that is within your reach along the way, you can make 1 strike against them maplessly until the end of this action. This is fantastic in closed quarters. In open spaces, this is really situational because it's very hard to have more than 1 or 2 enemies perfectly lined up to be both within your reach while also letting you be adjacent to a prop the whole time while running along them. But do note here that this illustrates the problem with Caroming Charge. This is a fine feat because it only allows 1 strike against 1 creature. Caroming Charge has no such limitation, so it is just better than this feat, despite being 12 levels lower. So with all of these risky feats, we now have a complete picture of the Daredevil. The Daredevil is light on defense. It is more of a skirmisher. It's not very high on damage. It's not trying to be very high on damage, so don't evaluate it as a martial damage dealer. Don't try to compare it to just a barbarian who runs into combat raging and deals damage. Don't even compare it to a swashbuckler whose biggest contribution to combat is the big damage their finishers do. Don't compare it to Rogue's sneak attack, even though that scaling superficially looks similar to sneak attack. The Daredevil is a skirmishing controller. Your goal is to get to enemies, grapple them, trip them, move them into inconvenient positions, and along the way deal some incidental damage, either because of stunt damage or because of the wild efficiency of your flourish and press options. You'll notice that the Daredevil has some of the most aggressive action compression in the game. Rushing Stride is in many ways better than Sudden Charge because it's just 1 action. It does not require committal to 2 actions. A lot of the press actions are like 3 actions worth of value embedded into 1. The Wheeling Pull, for example, involves both a grab, a pull, and a movement. And likewise, Forceful Kickoff involves a leap, a shove, and potentially damage depending on whether there's a prop near the enemy or not. So the Daredevil is a battlefield controller with a really efficient action economy. Hell, it's probably more similar to a Flurry of Maneuvers monk than it is to the Swashbuckler in the way it's going to end up feeling and playing. Your whole goal is going to be to set up these big turns where you lock down 1 or 2 enemies with a nice combination of options. And if you evaluate the Daredevil in that lens, the Daredevil's doing a pretty good job at it, despite needing some changes to make sure that it's perfect at its job. With all of the Daredevil's features and most of their feats covered, and with a good understanding of their gameplay loop, let's get into my final thoughts. First up, the things that I love. The Daredevil just looks incredibly fun to me. I know it's gotten a bit of a negative reception, partially due to those, in my opinion, unfair criticisms about having overlap with the Swashbuckler, and partially because it does need tuning in many places, in particular for its defenses. More on the tuning later, but I'm just a big fan of cool martials. Frankly, I'm a little tired of martials that signpost striking as the first and main thing you do. I really enjoy the Commander because it's not about what strikes you make, it's about what you give your friends. And no, it's not just strikes you give your friends, you give them a lot more other cool things like movement and healing and temp HP and resistances and spells, etc. And for the same reasons I love the Commander, I love the Daredevil. It's another martial who doesn't signpost striking as the main thing they do. Frankly, I think the wider community is a little obsessed with martials who make strikes all the time. Martials can do a lot more than striking. You can make really good control-focused fighters. You can make really good control-focused giant barbarians. You can make really cool buff and debuff-focused outwit rangers. But none of that seems to matter because the wider community largely just treats every martial as being a strike bot. one that either has to get map reduction on its own turn to strike as many times as possible, or get as many reactions as possible for off-turn strikes. I have long held the hot take that you don't need that to succeed, and I'm hoping the Daredevil's existence forces more people to acknowledge that. Because between the Daredevil and other pre-existing options like the Commander, the Guardian, the Champion, we now have a whole bunch of martial classes that don't get a damage booster by default, so they're not focused on maximizing what they do with the strike. And a lot of the criticisms of the Daredevil in this regard are circular. Criticizing stunt damage for not always being on inherently comes from the assumption that the Daredevil should be a martial who's dealing damage all the time and being really good at making strikes, or pretending that shoves are strikes, but that's not what every martial is. And I'm really glad to see Paizo build out martial classes that don't even have the option to be good strikers. I think the game is healthier for it, and I really hope Paizo stays the course with the Daredevil, because I would be so disappointed if on release, the Daredevil is yet another martial who just makes strikes and meta strikes and has some kind of passive damage booster that is incredibly easy to enable, like rage or sneak attack or finishers. I'm really glad to see the Daredevil in the shape it's in right now, and I want to see this course with some tuned numbers. Beyond that, I love the design niches that the Daredevil explores. Like I said, they're halfway between a swashbuckler and a fighter, but they're also filling out a new design space that wasn't really that explored before, that of a mundane martial artist. Martial artists in Pathfinder are sort of shoehorned into the monk class, and that comes with a lot of preternatural baggage. You can, of course, make other classes that are unarmed, but they're not going to be as good as the monk unless they rely on something specific, like an ancestry weapon, like say the Kolo's Jaws, that are really good. There is the Animal Instinct Barbarian that specializes in unarmed attacks, but again, that's preternatural. Hell, that's outright supernatural, not even preternatural. And finally, there's the martial artist archetype, but that archetype is built around stances that the monk uses, so really it is inheriting some of that preternatural flavor just without calling itself a monk. This is a way for you to build a martial artist that is fully mundane. You can be focused on unarmed attacks. You can do a lot of wrestling and athletics-based crowd control, and you have the whole breakaway attack chain of feats, which you can use to just bash people's heads in. I realize now I never showed their follow-up feats before. Breakaway attack has some follow-ups that make it better at making multiple attacks at a time. So I think the Daredevil not only does a good job differentiating itself mechanically from the classes it has some thematic overlap with, it's also introducing a whole bunch of new thematics that Pathfinder struggled to represent before. That of the mundane martial artist, the Jackie Chan, the Daredevil as in the Marvel superhero, etc. And mechanically, it is exploring a design space that's really reminiscent of Draw Steel to me. It has a lot of force movement. That force movement deals damage, and it is moving around a lot. It makes the battlefield much more kinetic. That is cool, and I'm happy to see Pathfinder take inspiration from Draw Steel in this regard. Maybe this is an indication that in the 3rd edition, we're going to see more such gameplay in the first place embedded into the game. One can certainly hope. Then, like I mentioned before, this class is a lot stronger than people are giving it credit for. I think it's one of the strongest athletics users in the game. Numerically, the Gymnast Swashbuckler probably beats it at levels 10 plus because of Daring Do. Monks are great contenders for having almost the same efficiency as the Daredevil, though I think the Daredevil beats them in action efficiency when it comes to using athletics and acrobatics as crowd control tools. And finally, the Flurry Ranger can definitely give the Daredevil a run for its money on reliability for follow-up attacks, especially press actions like Combat Grab, but the Ranger can only do so against one target, whereas the Daredevil can do it against all their targets with their insane action economy that is much better than the Rangers, because Rangers have to use Hunt Prey in situations where there's more than one enemy on the battlefield. So I really do think that the Daredevil is up there among some of the strongest athletics users in the game. I think press trait map reduction is sick. I can confirm this from experience. People underrate it heavily. Why is it that the fighter is the one given the most press actions? Because they have 2 higher accuracy than everyone else. So if you consider a baseline martial as making attacks at, say, 0, -4, -8, assuming an agile weapon, like their grappling, for example, the fighter is making it at +2, -2, -6. And now the reason I say I can confirm this from experience is because I have played a wrestler flurry ranger and it felt incredible. Tripping an enemy with your first action and then combat grabbing them with your second felt really impressive. And the Daredevil is capable of that level of reliability, a little less because Audacious Combatant is a little less accurate than Flurry Ranger, but the Daredevil gets a lot more action efficiency, like I said before, and that's why it keeps up with the best athletics users in the game. Now, I do think the Daredevil has a pretty unforgiving skill floor, because when a martial is played at its skill floor, all you're going to be doing is dealing damage with strikes and relying on everyone else to babysit you. The Daredevil cannot really be played that way. I think that's fine. The Commander can't be played that way. The Guardian cannot be played that way. It's okay for martials to have complexity and unforgiving skill floors. That should never just be the wheelhouse of spellcasters, and I'm really glad to see Paizo continue to design martials who are capable of having complex decision trees throughout their turns. I don't think every martial just making a strike or tripping a foe on their turn and then using reactive strikes off turn would be healthy for the game, and I'm really glad that Paizo doesn't push every martial into strike maxing. And finally, I wanted to mention the Daredevil has some fantastic synergy in caster-heavy parties. I mentioned this in my video about how you can cheerlead your spellcaster buddies. Shove is a great way to work with your spellcasters because spellcasters are excellent at setting up areas of damaging and hazardous terrain. You can use Shove or Forceful Kickoff Stunt to throw enemies into dangerous terrain. You can use Wheeling Pull Stunt to perhaps drag enemies back into terrain, subject to GM fiat. More on that later because force movement rules are weird. And of course, casters can just give you props. They can summon a creature larger than you and you can use that creature as a prop. They can use sliding blocks, wall of stone. They can create props on a battlefield that otherwise was sparse in those options for you, thereby enabling your stunt damage. And then they can combo those with other things that also do damage. So if, say, you have an arcane and a primal caster in the backline, one can use a wall of stone, divide the battlefield into two halves. Then the other can use something like corrosive muck. The enemy comes out of it, you shove them back into the corrosive muck, and they take some stunt damage from the wall of stone behind them. So the Daredevil is an excellent way to play a martial that synergizes with your spellcasters, which I'm always a fan of. Now for my thoughts on things that need small changes. First up, I think the risk-reward trade-offs are a little too tuned towards risk. You'll notice that when I was talking about the feats, there were quite a few that I described as being good or fantastic, but there were also a few that I was just like, I don't know if it's worth using them. The 2-action press options, a couple of the risky options. And I do think the payoffs just generally need more punch. So anything with the press trait, anything that requires adrenaline, and anything that especially consumes adrenaline, definitely needs more punch. The 1-action temp HP feat at level 10, for example, is really weak. The acrobatics to knock enemies prone feat almost feels like a reflavored trip, and I don't think that's good. This class takes on a lot of risk for using many of its actions. The payoffs for that risk need to be huge. They need to all feel as good as Wheeling Pull Stunt, or Hit or Miss, or the 2-action feat that auto-upgrades hits into crits. Otherwise, you risk an inexperienced player selecting some of these worse feats and then just not living up to the fantasy the class sold. In particular, actions that have both the press and risky trait do have some issues. It is nice that risky takes effect before you make your checks, because that means you benefit from Audacious Combatant on your press action, but that inherently doesn't make the action fantastic. Press has a downside. Press can never be used as your first action, which means critical successes are not that likely on your press action, even with Audacious Combatant. And it means critical failures are more likely. And it means 2-action press options are pretty hard to sequence, and all of these need tuning. Either it needs more payoff, or it needs to more consistently enable itself. Hell, some of these risky options could just have the press trait removed and just be used as a first action, which you then follow up with one of the many press trait actions you have. And then, like I mentioned right at the start, the Daredevil needs some defensive help. I definitely think Reflex needs to go up to Legendary. I don't think it gets to just stay at Master. I think it's a bit of a thematic fail for this class to not get Legendary Reflex. And like I mentioned, HP progression can stay at 8 HP. I'm fine with that, but then the class needs more active defenses to justify that. Almost all other 8 HP classes have some kind of massive flexibility boost, justifying having less HP than the 10 HP marshals. Obviously, all of the spellcasters have a huge amount of flexibility from spells, and kineticists both have almost spell-like flexibility, nowhere near as much as a full roster of spells, but they still get to replicate some of that, and they have Constitution as their key attribute, which means their HP scales better than it looks like. Alchemists have their variety of versatile vials they can brew up during the day. Rogues and investigators have accelerated skill progression / skill feed progression. I know the investigator only gets one of those, I just keep forgetting which one it is that it gets. And finally, the inventor doesn't get as much benefit for being an 8 HP class, and is widely regarded as being a little undertuned because of it. So the Daredevil needs something more to justify being 8 HP. Maybe move that temp HP feature from level 19 down to level 7 or level 3. Maybe embed some of the defensive reactions you get as feats into the baseline character progression. Maybe make it a little easier to get those conditional bonuses to speed and or AC, and maybe just give more skill increases. The Daredevil could definitely use one of athletics and acrobatics autoscaling, and maybe both. And then there is the issue that props have wonky interactions with forced movement, unfortunately. Forced movement in this game is restricted. If it is not a push or a pull, then it is not intended to be able to move an enemy into a place where they can take damage. Now, some members of the community treat push and pull as keywords because that is the most natural reading of those rules. That being said, we have had clarification separately on the Roll for Combat Discord from Mark Seifter that the intent of these rules isn't about whether the word push or pull is used in the action's name or text. The intent is that it should move enemies directly away or towards you without giving you any freedom to reposition them. I will link that clarification in the video description below. Now, force movement is already pretty wonky to rule without props getting involved, because you cannot reposition an enemy off a ledge, for example. You probably cannot reposition an enemy into a wall of fire, but then it gets hazy because can you reposition them into difficult terrain? Probably. Difficult terrain doesn't damage you, it's not hazardous terrain. Can you reposition them into something that damages them but isn't hazardous terrain, like a hazard? Probably not. Can you reposition an enemy who can't breathe underwater into water? Probably not. That's dangerous for them. But then are you suddenly allowed to do that if they have the ability to breathe underwater? It's all really wonky all around, and props make it weirder because now walls deal stunt damage. So anything that directly moves an enemy away from you, like forceful kickoff stunt, is allowed to move an enemy and have it stopped by a wall. But what about wheeling pull stunt? Can you pull an enemy with you and then reposition them into a wall? Is that an intended use of stunt damage? When you use escaping shuffle, can you reposition an enemy to bang them into a wall? Is that an intended use of stunt damage? I think it's intended, but that's not clear from reading the force movement rules. A GM can interpret that since the wall is damaging the creature, you're not allowed to reposition them into it, only push or pull. And this means prop value is GM dependent in this regard. And that's on top of the fact that some GMs might not incorporate props into the environments you fight in, which was already a layer of GM dependency. Not a disastrous level of GM dependency, to be clear, but still a meaningful amount. There are going to be some battlefields on which you just happen to be near no props. Now, if on top of that, reposition effects are also up to GM fiat on whether they're allowed to trigger stunt damage or not, I think that's an issue, and I think that really needs clarification. I think the prop trait needs to explicitly override forced movement restrictions so that every Daredevil can have a consistent experience at the tables they play at. And then there's definitely some tension with size. Creatures larger than you are props, which incentivize you to be smaller. Even if you're not tiny, which, like I said, was a silly consideration, being medium would be an advantage because large enemies are relatively common. But if you're medium, some of your feats don't work on huge enemies, because those feats specify that they're locked to enemies one size larger than you and don't scale with Titan Wrestler. So I think, for one, Daredevil should get Titan Wrestler by default, and two, all of your feats need to scale as if Titan Wrestler affects them, and not just be locked to one size larger than you. Because right now, I think it is optimal for Daredevils to be large so that they can use a lot of their feats on huge enemies, and then just kind of deal with the fact that they can't use large enemies as props. And I don't like this bit of tension. And finally, I think we need more action compression on shove, reposition, etc. Like, an action similar to Brutish Shove would be really nice, because now you would have the option to both make a strike and potentially benefit from stunt damage. I know that this would create that little bit of a problem that I talked about, where people who want to treat all marshals as strike maxers will then just use this to justify playing the Daredevil that way. But I think it's fine, because the class at a baseline would still very much be a debuffer and controller, with an option for you to do some strikes and damage along the way. Likewise, Combat Crab feels like a press action that should really be on the Daredevil's roster, and I don't know if Paizo didn't include it in the playtest because it just always intended to include it anyways in the final release and thought it needed no playtesting, but it definitely needs to be in the Daredevil's final release. Or maybe Trips should benefit from stunt damage in some way, maybe not full damage, maybe just half. I think that would be a nice way to incentivize Daredevils to use their control actions and still get some nice damage benefit from it. Regardless, this is the least important of the changes we need. The other three changes are much more important. They need defensive help. The risk-reward trade-offs need some tuning, and props need clarification. But it would be nice to have a little bit of action compression with strike plus shove or trip plus stunt damage if possible, and ideally we want these feats to be better than that reflavor trip feat we talked about a few slides ago. And finally, things that need major changes and even overhauls. First up, stunt damage working with shove is great because shove is a good action. It sometimes has some action denial involved, and it synergizes with your spellcaster buddies, and now you get to deal some damage off of it. But there is a problem. A non-Daredevil character already has an option to keep up with the Daredevil's stunt damage, punishing shove from the Guardian, which an archetype character can pick up as early as level 4 at the cost of 2 feats, Guardian Dedication at level 2, and then punishing shove at level 4. Punishing shove very nearly keeps up with the Daredevil's stunt damage without being as conditional as the stunt damage, and I don't think that's healthy. Level 4, punishing shove will deal 4 damage, 8 on a critical success, whereas stunt damage is around 7.5 on average. Remember that stunt damage does not double its damage on a crit because this is an athletics check, not a strike, so it doesn't automatically double damage. It has to specify that it does, and stunt damage doesn't specify that. By level 20, punishing shove is 19 damage, 38 on a crit, while stunt damage is an average of 24.5. So in both cases, stunt damage is a little ahead of punishing shove, but punishing shove has the option to crit, which catches it up or even exceeds stunt damage. And remember, punishing shove has the benefit of always applying. It doesn't need a prop for you to bounce the enemy off of. And this is sort of a problem because it sort of intrudes on the Daredevil's niche. That being said, I don't think it's the biggest problem. I have seen some online discourse overblowing this half of the problem, where other characters can keep up with the Daredevil, but keep in mind, the Daredevil's not just using a basic shove. They're using options like Forceful Kickoff Stunt, which are letting them put distance from an enemy and also shove them. Or they're using options like Wheeling Pull Stunt, which, as long as you're allowed to reposition enemies for stunt damage, will also have the enemy grabbed as part of it. So I don't think most characters will outperform the Daredevil's stunt damage outright with Punishing Shove, but then there's the consideration of Centaurs. Centaurs can get a level 1 Ancestry feat that auto-upgrades shoves into critical successes. So now you're never dealing 4/19 damage, you're always dealing 8/38 damage with Punishing Shove, which means at level 4 you're keeping up with stunt damage very reliably, and at level 20 you are flat out exceeding stunt damage. And you're exceeding some of the highest rolls it can get. It's very unlikely that stunt damage will actually get to 38 to 42 damage, which is the maximum range of what 5d6 plus 6 will roll. So a non-Centaur character is not outdoing the Daredevil in the crowd control plus incidental damage department, but a Centaur definitely is. And then there's the combination problem, where a Daredevil can archetype into Punishing Shove and deal a combined total of both of those, while also being a Centaur, which is inherently good for the Daredevil because it is a high speed, large ancestry, and with Practice Brawn that upgrades your success into a crit success, you're now dealing 15.5 average damage at level 4, and you're dealing 62.5 average damage at level 20. And if there's no prop, that's fine, because Punishing Shove without a prop is still going to be really good damage with Practiced Brawn. If you really wanted to get crazy with it, you can stack a few other options with it too. For example, the Barbarian's Brutal Bully. Though that being said, I don't think you need to stack every single option. I think just being Centaur, Daredevil with Punishing Shove is already good enough to make you arguably too good at using shoves to deal damage. And I hope Paizo addresses this in the final release. We need stunt damage to be a little higher, we need it to perhaps be a little less conditional, and we need it not to stack with Punishing Shove. And I don't know how to accomplish it other than just releasing an errata that nerfs Punishing Shove, or maybe nerfs Practiced Brawn on the Centaur, but ultimately let's see what it comes out as. Hopefully Paizo can figure out a solution for this. Then, I think the class has this problem where it's trying to be a few too many things. So at a baseline, it's trying to be a fighter-like Metastrike specialist that applies a lot of debuffs and control options. That's great. It's also trying to be an environment damage dealer and improvised weapons user, and that is also great. And finally, it's also trying to be a skirmisher that wants to keep some distance. And I think this third option is introducing tension into the first two, because the first two can kind of go hand in hand. There's nothing really that forces Breakaway Attack to not be part of your rotation as a debuff controller, and in fact, it synergizes pretty well because having both your hands free is already good for an Athletics Marshal, and having a way to just deal a bunch of damage with the environment is also really good. But now you also want to be a skirmisher. Now you have a bunch of options that put distance between you and the enemies, or even drag enemies with you if they want to. You also have pretty low defenses because you're built like a skirmisher, and all of these clash. And I think the Daredevil needs to drop one of these three niches. Either it needs to drop the skirmisher niche and just be built like a tank, be built to survive in melee, or it needs to drop one of the other two niches slightly just to ease up the action economy enough that it's then able to sequence in active defenses while keeping distance, while still getting the option to do all of the control debuffing that it wants to. My preference would, of course, be that the Daredevil just gets many more passive ways to be defensively viable, because I really like the first two niches it's filling, whereas I don't think it needs to be that good of a skirmisher. And then finally, this is really just a wishlist item. I wish Breakaway Attack is used as a template for improvised weapons at a baseline. Maybe drop the damage size, maybe drop some traits, I'm fine with that. But the default improvised weapons rules being so inconvenient, and then classes trying to rectify that the way the Weapon Improviser Archetype or the Magus Hybrid study that's based around water and improvised weapons, and now the Daredevil are trying to do, I would really rather improvised weapons rules just be robust at a baseline. And then the next is an even more of a wishlist item. I wish environment damage was more cleanly embedded into the game rather than being specific to the Daredevil. That being said, this is an obvious pipe dream. My previous wishlist item can definitely be done through errata. The improvised weapons rules are not that complex. They can be errata to work more conveniently. Stunt damage cannot be errata to be a baseline feature of the game, because it creates so many combination problems. Hell, the Daredevil already created a combination problem with punishing shove, didn't it? Imagine how much worse things could get if options like Whirling Throw or Juggernaut Charge were also potentially able to deal stunt damage. So this is very much a pipe dream, and you cannot just errata that into the game, but I am hopeful that the Daredevil ends up giving them some valuable insight into how this could be incorporated into Pathfinder 3rd edition whenever that ends up happening. So that will be all for today's video, folks. My final verdict is that the Daredevil is in a decent place already. It definitely needs some tuning in its defenses and in a whole lot of other places. It needs a lot of its feats to be changed, but the skeleton is good. I think it needs fewer changes in the Slayer to be in a good place. And I think both of these classes need substantially fewer changes than the Guardian did to be in a good place. And I think people are really underrating the Daredevil. The Daredevil is not a strike maxing martial. The Daredevil is a martial crowd controller who incidentally deals a bunch of damage along the way while skirmishing across the battlefield. And while there is some tension between some of those fantasies, it's nothing that can't be ironed out. And overall, I'm pretty happy with this playtest and pretty excited to try this out in a playtest one-shot in the near future. I hope you enjoyed this video, folks. If you did, please like and comment. If you want to see my future videos, please subscribe and press the notifications button. It really helps to support the channel. And of course, if you can join a channel membership, that is the most direct way to support me and to show me that you want to see more of my content. I have been trying to accelerate my content release schedule from what it was like in the second half of last year, and I'm hoping to aim for more growth, and every little bit that you can do to help the algorithm will ultimately help me, and it'll help me justify making these videos more frequently. And hopefully, once I'm done playtesting both the Slayer and the Daredevil, I can release a short video with my adjusted thoughts of what they feel like once they're actually in play rather than just from a reading. That's all for today, folks. Mathfinder out.